In the realm of aviation, certain tragic events etch themselves into history, forever shaping the industry's landscape and pushing it toward progress and reform. The Tenerife disaster of 1977 stands as one such haunting episode, leaving an indelible mark on the collective consciousness of those involved and the broader world of air travel. As we delve into the intricacies of this fateful day, we unravel a tale of interconnected decisions, systemic flaws, and the fragility of human lives in the face of unforeseen circumstances. Beyond the devastating loss of 583 lives, the Tenerife disaster sparks reflection on the profound impact of procedural shortcomings, communication breakdowns, and infrastructure deficiencies. Join us on a journey through the events that unfolded on that ill-fated day, exploring the complex web of factors that converged to create one of aviation's most tragic chapters. It was an impactful event that reverberated across the globe. On a windy island in the Atlantic Ocean, two Boeing 747s collided on a fog-covered runway, leading to the tragic loss of 583 lives. The narrative of this air disaster, deemed the worst in history, has been recounted numerous times by survivors, firefighters unaware of the catastrophe's scale, investigators revealing the cause, and storytellers driven to share the unfolding events. Journalists, authors, sociologists, and behavioral scientists have all contributed their perspectives, reflecting on the ordinary nature of disaster, the capriciousness of coincidence, and the randomness of fate. However, the events of March 27, 1977, unfolded within an environment conducive to such an outcome, a series of misguided human decisions shaping the rules of the game long before the two 747s arrived in the Canary Islands. As we delve into another account of the Tenerife disaster, it's essential to momentarily step back from the glaring carnage and accusations to ponder more profound questions. What lessons were learned? How can the loss of so many lives be imbued with more meaning, even more than 4 decades later? These elusive answers continue to draw us back to that fateful day on Tenerife, far southwest of Portugal. In the gleaming subtropical waters near the Moroccan coast, lie the Canary Islands. Comprising 7 volcanic summits rising from the Atlantic, these islands have been integral to metropolitan Spain since the 15th century. Despite attracting around 2 million tourists in 1975, the Canaries weren't then considered a major travel hub. The archipelago's travel infrastructure, designed for the tourism realities of the 1960s, frequently struggled under the increased strain. Yet, when aviation experts in the 1970s warned of an inevitable collision between 2 jumbo jets, they anticipated it in New York, London, or Los Angeles, not at a small single-runway airport on an island off the African coast, far from the traditionally busiest airways in the world. Believe it or not, March 27, 1977, started as an ordinary day. Just past midnight, Captain Victor Grubbs, First Officer Robert Bob Bragg, and Flight Engineer George Warnes arrived at New York's John F. Kennedy International Airport for their duty on a Pan American Airways tourist charter to the Canary Islands. Aboard the double-decker Boeing 747-100 were 380 passengers, many retired couples on a package cruise, accompanied by a crew of 16. For the seasoned pilots, this journey would have been routine, a repetition of numerous flights accumulated over their extensive careers, totaling a combined 47,000 flying hours. As the 747, known as Clipper Victor, took off that night, the passengers could not have been in more capable hands. Meanwhile, an ocean away at Schiphol Airport in Amsterdam, the crew of a KLM Royal Dutch Airlines Boeing 747-200 also prepared for their flight to the Canary Islands. Captain Jacob Louis Veldhuizen van Zanten, a living legend at KLM, led the crew. Renowned as the face of the airline's advertising campaign and the head of its Boeing 747 training program, Captain Van Zanten spent most of his time training new pilots. The journey to Gran Canaria would mark his first regular line flight in 12 weeks. First Officer Klaus Mers, though not a rookie, had recently upgraded to the 747, accumulating a mere 95 hours since obtaining his type rating, personally granted by Captain Van Zanten. Flight engineer Willem Schroeder, the most experienced, had over 17,000 flight hours and held the position of president and co-founder of the European Flight Engineers Organization, a major international trade union. Accompanying this prestigious crew were 11 flight attendants and 235 passengers, mostly young Dutch families heading to the Canaries for sun and surf, courtesy of tour operator Holland International. The destination for both Pan Am Flight 1736 and KLM Flight 4805 was Gran Canaria Airport, situated in the city of Las Palmas on the island of Gran Canaria. At the time, this was the largest airport in the Canary Islands and served as the main port of entry for tourists arriving from abroad. However, this prominence also made it a target for those dissatisfied with the island's governance. In contrast to many other North Atlantic archipelagos, the Canary Islands were not uninhabited when Europeans arrived in the 1400s. The indigenous Guanches had called the islands home since the first millennium BC. Even after 500 years of colonization, some of their descendants had not forgotten the atrocities committed against their community. With the unraveling of dictator Francisco Franco's oppressive regime after his death in 1975, a pro-independence political party seized the opportunity to launch an armed wing, the Fuerzas Armadas Guanches. Their stated aim was to achieve self-government for the Canary Islands through terrorism. While the group never directly caused fatalities during its brief existence, it became notorious for setting in motion a chain of events that surpassed their modest terroristic ambitions. In the early afternoon of March 27, the Fuerzas Armadas Guanches set off an improvised bomb inside a florist's shop within the terminal at Gran Canaria Airport, causing injury to the shopkeeper. Prompted by a subsequent phone call warning of another bomb, authorities swiftly closed and evacuated the airport. As bomb detection squads meticulously searched for additional explosive devices, hundreds of individuals were hurried to safety. Meanwhile, airborne crews of the Pan Am and KLM 747s received the unwelcome news that their intended destination, Gran Canaria Airport, was temporarily closed. All incoming traffic, they were informed, would be redirected to the neighboring island of Tenerife. Despite Pan Am's plea, expressing their fuel adequacy to hold over Gran Canaria for several hours, the controller couldn't grant their request without a definite timeline for reopening the airport. Consequently, all flights had to land on Tenerife, awaiting clearance to proceed to Gran Canaria later. Tenerife, in 1977, had a modest single-runway airport named Los Rodeos, nestled between two mountain peaks at an elevation exceeding 2,000 feet, 600 meters, above sea level. Primarily accustomed to smaller jets from private low-cost and holiday-focused European airlines, it lacked the infrastructure for accommodating Boeing 747s. The airport lacked radar, a runway visibility measuring system, taxiway markings, and the centerline lights were inoperative. Compounding the situation, it was a Sunday, and the control tower was understaffed. Shortly after the Gran Canaria bomb explosion, a continuous stream of planes began arriving at Los Rodeos. KLM Flight 4805, among the first, landed at 13:38. In anticipation of additional arrivals, controllers directed it to park at the end of the main taxiway intersecting runway 12. Expecting delays, the KLM crew allowed their passengers to disembark into the terminal, issuing special ID cards for identification at the layover's end. Meanwhile, a queue of planes built up behind it, including Pan Am Flight 1736, arriving at 14:15. By 14:30, the number of planes had grown so much that the queue extended across the parking apron and into parts of the main taxiway. At 14:30, just 15 minutes after the Pan Am 747's arrival at Los Rodeos, bomb squads completed their Gran Canaria airport sweep, finding no second bomb. The airport promptly reopened. Upon receiving this news, the Pan Am crew requested permission to start their engines and taxi to the runway for takeoff, hoping to follow the lead of several smaller planes. However, the controller informed them that they probably wouldn't fit past the KLM 747 parked at the end of the taxiway. Furthermore, turning around and taxiing in the opposite direction was impossible due to limited space for a 180-degree turn. Having been on duty throughout the day, and with restless passengers, the Pan Am pilots sought to depart. First Officer Bob Bragg and Flight Engineer George Warnes left the aircraft to assess whether they could navigate past the KLM 747, only to return disappointed. After measuring the distance between the KLM's wing and the taxiway's edge, they found it to be 4 meters too narrow. As it unfolded, the KLM 747 crew found themselves in an even more challenging predicament. In 1974, the Netherlands enacted stringent new flight duty time limits, with pilots potentially facing criminal liability for exceeding them, ranging from license revocation to imprisonment. Adding complexity, a 1976 law altered how duty time limits were calculated, making it so intricate that pilots had to contact the company to ascertain their limits. Understandably, the KLM Flight 4805 pilots were concerned about making it back to Amsterdam within their duty time, risking severe penalties. At Los Rodeos, a KLM dispatcher advised them that departing Gran Canaria by 1900 hours should keep them within limits. But they needed to confirm later. Failure to meet the deadline would force them to cancel the flight, requiring KLM to secure enough hotel rooms for 235 passengers and 14 crew during the peak tourist season on a small island. Unfortunately, a timely departure from Los Rodeos proved challenging. The process of gathering all KLM passengers extended until 1600 hours, an hour and a half after Gran Canaria reopened. Aboard the Pan Am aircraft, frustration mounted as flight attendants struggled to tend to passengers who had boarded in Los Angeles the previous evening, depleting all food and drink aboard the 747. Expressing their discontent with the KLM pilots, the Pan Am crew found themselves powerless to expedite the process. As they had to wait until the KLM plane cleared the taxiway, in the end, the KLM cabin crew couldn't corral all 235 passengers. Rabina van Landschot, a Dutch tour guide on Tenerife, deviated from protocol and left the airport without permission, a minor act of disobedience that ultimately saved her life. Unbeknownst to her, out of the 249 passengers and crew on Flight 4805, she would be the sole survivor. Simultaneously, KLM Captain Jacob van Zanten made another strategic decision to further delay their departure from Tenerife but potentially reduce their overall duty time. After boarding all passengers, he opted to refuel with an additional 55,500 liters, sufficient not only for the journey to Gran Canaria but also all the way back to Amsterdam. Anticipating long refueling lines in Gran Canaria due to diverted planes returning, Van Zanten decided it made more sense to refuel in Tenerife. Later assessments would provide conflicting conclusions on the necessity of this decision. Throughout the afternoon, the weather conditions at Los Rodeos continued to worsen. Tenerife's elevation directly intersects with the prevailing oceanic winds from the Atlantic, leading to unpredictable weather on the upwind slope of the island. This challenge intensifies, particularly on the saddle between the island's primary mountain ranges, where the terrain channels clouds rapidly over Los Rodeos Airport. By the time KLM Flight 4805 commenced refueling around 1600 hours, clouds were already streaking over the airport, causing intermittent periods of low visibility. Both flight crews were keenly aware that if visibility dropped below the minimum required for takeoff, they would be stranded on Tenerife overnight. At 1651, KLM Flight 4805 completed refueling and sought clearance to start its engines, with Pan Am Flight 1736 making the same request just 20 seconds later. Following final checks and engine warm-up, the KLM 747 taxied onto runway 12. Due to the prevailing westerly wind, both planes needed to take off from runway 30, necessitating taxiing to the far end of the runway before making a 180-degree turn. This process became increasingly challenging due to diminishing visibility and the numerous planes still parked on various taxiways. The controller faced difficulties in determining the best way to manage the massive 747s. After initial indecision about the route, he eventually instructed the KLM crew to backtaxi, up the runway in the opposite direction and make a 180-degree turn at the far end. 4 minutes later, he cleared the Pan Am 747 to follow the KLM up the runway and turn off at the third exit, the closest one not obstructed by parked airplanes. Captain Grubbs expressed his dissatisfaction with taxiing on the runway before the KLM plane had taken off but chose not to insist with a controller whose command of English seemed uncertain. Both 747s inched along the runway in the midst of swirling fog, causing the controller and the two crews to lose sight of each other. With no ground radar available, the controller had to depend on pilot reports to track the 747's locations. However, for the pilots, determining their position and intended direction proved challenging. Visibility fluctuated rapidly between approximately 100 and 900 meters, with the taxiways lacking signs or painted numbers. To compound matters, the controller's thick Spanish accent posed difficulties for the Pan Am crew in understanding his instructions. When the controller mentioned, "Leave the runway third one your left, sick," the pilots spent the next 2 minutes deciphering whether he said first or third. Meanwhile, the controller inquired of the KLM crew, KLM 4805. "How many taxiways did you pass?" "I think I just passed Charlie 4 now," replied First Officer Mers, noting what seemed to be the fourth and final taxiway veering off to his left. "Okay, at the end of the runway, make 180 and report, ready for ATC clearance," instructed the controller. After multiple confusing exchanges, Pan Am First Officer Bragg finally sought clarification, asking, "Would you confirm that you want the Clipper 1736 to turn left at the third intersection?" "The third one, sir, 123, third one," clarified the controller. "That's what we need, right?" queried Captain Grubbs. "Uno, dos, tres," affirmed Flight Engineer Warnes. While the Pan Am crew went through their taxi checklist, the KLM 747 reached the end of the runway, initiating its careful 180-degree turn. Captain Van Zanten concentrated intensely, given that the 747 requires 42 meters for a turnaround, and the runway was only 46 meters wide. The Pan Am crew, still navigating the runway, grappled with locating the third taxiway. Their charts indicated that the third exit was a narrow strip curving sharply back in their direction, requiring 2 consecutive 148-degree turns to access the main taxiway running parallel to the runway. Subsequent analysis revealed that a Boeing 747 couldn't execute the second turn due to narrow taxiways. The Pan Am crew had an instinctive awareness of this limitation. But the controller, unfamiliar with the 747's capabilities, was not. "That's 2, Captain Grubbs noted as the second exit drifted past in the dense fog. Over the next minute, the crew struggled to identify the actual third exit. "Yeah, that's the 45 there," commented Flight Engineer Warnes. "Yeah, that's this one right here. Yeah, I know, next one is almost a 45, but yeah, but it goes ahead. I think it's gonna put us on the taxiway. Yeah, just a little bit. Yeah, maybe he counts these as 3. Considering the 747's inability to navigate the third taxiway, the crew pondered whether the controller started counting up to 3 from their position when the message was sent, by which time they had already passed the first one. This would imply they should exit via the fourth and final exit, suitable for a 747. However, uncertainty prevailed. "I like this," someone dryly commented. It didn't require hindsight to recognize the perilous situation they were in. On KLM Flight 4805, the crew completed the last item on the takeoff checklist, and First Officer Mers declared the checklist complete. Visibility then stood at 900 meters, but another dense cloud wave approached down the runway at approximately 6 meters per second. With a minimum takeoff visibility requirement of 300 meters, they understood the need to commence rolling before being enveloped again. Captain Van Zanten began advancing the throttle levers, but First Officer Mers interjected, "Wait a minute, we do not have an ATC clearance." Van Zanten pulled the throttles back to idle. "No, I know that," he acknowledged. "Go ahead, ask, it's essential to note that ATC clearance differs from takeoff clearance. ATC clearance outlines the route the plane will follow after departure but doesn't grant permission to depart. KLM 4805 is now ready for takeoff, and we are waiting for our ATC clearance, reported First Officer Mers over the radio. KLM 4805, you are cleared to the Papa beacon, climb to and maintain flight level 900, right turn after takeoff. Proceed with heading 040 until intercepting the 325 radial from Las Palmas Vr, responded the controller. First Officer Mers began reading back the clearance. Roger sir, we are cleared to the Papa beacon, flight level 90. At that moment, Captain Van Zanten pushed the throttles to takeoff power and declared, we're going. Caught off guard, First Officer Mers rushed to complete his transmission, right turnout 040 until intercepting the 325. We are now, at takeoff. Even after extensive post-analysis, it remained uncertain whether Mers said, at takeoff or, taking off. Regardless, one thing was evident. No one interpreted him to mean that KLM Flight 4805 was already in motion. The controller assumed they were at the takeoff position but seemed momentarily uncertain. He replied with an okay, then hesitated, as if crafting a directive to cover all possibilities. After 2 seconds, he continued, stand by for takeoff, I will call you. Simultaneously, First Officer Bragg on the Pan AM, perceiving the pause as the end of the transmission, keyed his mic and stated, and we're still taxiing down the runway, the Clipper 1736. In a tragic coincidence, the simultaneous transmissions on the same frequency caused interference, manifesting as a loud squeal in the KLM cockpit, obscuring the words underneath. While the pilots could have deciphered the message with close attention, such focus wasn't typically required and, in this instance, was not applied. The only word the KLM pilots distinctly heard was the controller's okay, mistakenly taken as confirmation that the controller understood their intentions. Consequently, both the controller's instruction to await takeoff clearance and the Pan AM First Officer's position report went unnoticed by those who needed the information most. Thus, KLM Flight 4805 accelerated down the runway toward the ominous wall of fog, oblivious to the impending danger. Moments later, the controller instructed the Pan AM crew, Papa Alpha 1736, report the runway clear. Okay, we'll report when we're clear, responded First Officer Bragg. Thank you, acknowledged the controller. Let's get the hell out of here, exclaimed Captain Grubbs, eliciting nervous chuckles. Yeah, he's anxious, isn't he, remarked First Officer Bragg. Yeah, after he held us up for an hour and a half. That bastard, quipped Flight Engineer Warnes, now he's in a rush. On the KLM, Flight Engineer Schroeder, having overheard the Pan AM and Tower conversation, inquired, is he not clear then? What did you say? Captain Van Zanten asked, is he not clear, that Pan American? Schroeder repeated, oh yes, Van Zanten emphatically replied. The 747 continued to accelerate, heading directly toward the Pan AM jet still seeking the fourth exit. V1, First Officer Mers called out. Abort was no longer an option. At that instant, Pan AM Captain Victor Grubbs spotted the landing lights of the KLM 747 emerging from the fog. There he is, look at him, he shouted. God damn, that son of a bitch is coming. Grubbs sharply turned the tiller left and maxed out the engine power, attempting to divert the plane onto the grass. The input was so sudden that an alarm sounded, indicating takeoff in an improper configuration. Amid the blaring warning horn and engine roar, First Officer Bragg yelled, get off, get off, get off, get off. Yet, it was too late. All Bragg could do was duck. On the KLM, the Pan AM 747 materialized suddenly through the fog, its white bulk looming directly ahead. Oh shit, Captain Van Zanten exclaimed, pulling the control column back to the maximum in a desperate attempt to lift off. The tail collided with the runway, sparking a shower of sparks as the fully loaded 747, engine straining, valiantly struggled to become airborne. At the last moment, the wheels left the runway, and the aircraft lurched into the air, but it was too late. The time was 17:06 and 49 seconds, suspended in a nose-high position with its tail approximately 2 meters above the ground. KLM Flight 4805 violently collided broadside into Pan Am Flight 1736 at a speed of 260 km per hour. The impact resulted in the KLM aircraft's 4 engines, landing gear, and rear fuselage tearing through multiple locations on the right side of the Pan Am jet simultaneously. Engines, fuselage fragments, and ignited jet fuel scattered in all directions. KLM's No. 4 engine sliced off the fully occupied upper deck of Pan Am, propelling it down the runway, instantly claiming the lives of everyone on board. The main cabin ruptured, revealing a sky ablaze with orange hues. The collision itself transpired in a fraction of a second, then, KLM Flight 4805 was airborne but descending, irreparably damaged, back to the runway. 150 meters later, it crashed and fractured into 3 sections. The full load of fuel ignited, and the wreckage slid down the runway for an additional 300 meters, engulfed in flames. On Pan Am's 747, some passengers perished in the collision, but the majority of the 396 passengers and crew remained alive. First Officer Bragg, feeling only a mild impact, attempted to flip the fuel shutoff switches, only to discover that the entire overhead panel and the roof it attached to were gone. Upon turning around, he observed the absence of the first-class lounge and the entire upper portion of the plane. Sliced open, like a can of sardines, the evacuation commenced in a frantic frenzy of desperation from the moment it began. The rear of the economy-class cabin was so obstructed with debris that few, if any, managed to escape. It is presumed that they perished in the ensuing fire. Towards the front, passengers found exit routes through a hole in the twisted metal, emerging onto the left wing from where they jumped to the ground. Others braved the lengthy drop from an opening near the first-class cabin and from the L2 door, the sole emergency exit successfully opened. Survivors who managed to escape described scenes reminiscent of Dante's Inferno, a cabin engulfed in fire, smoke, and wreckage, where individuals sat paralyzed in their seats, utterly stunned, gazing into an endless distance. Explosions erupted in every direction, flames surged through shattered windows and rose through the torn floor. A younger crowd might have fared better, but the average age of those aboard exceeded 50, and many seemingly made no attempt to flee. In the cockpit, all 3 pilots survived the collision, but the stairs to the lower deck disappeared along with the lounge. They were compelled to jump down into the first-class cabin. Captain Grubbs reportedly fell through into the cargo hold, along with a flight attendant. Both managed to escape through a hole in the plane's bottom. Other flight attendants hurried to the left wing, estimating around 50 passengers directly above the still-spinning engines. One woman courageously jumped first, only to have everyone else land on top of her. Many suffered broken limbs or worse during the fall. As the crew urged survivors to run away from the blazing plane, a damaged engine exploded, hurling debris in all directions and claiming the life of a flight attendant. Shortly afterward, the fuel in the right wing ignited, leading to a more substantial explosion that tore through the plane from end to end, causing the remains of the twisted fuselage to collapse inward into a fiery abyss. In the control tower, the controllers faced an obscured view of the wreckage and fire due to dense fog. The unmistakable sound of 2 explosions reached them, triggering thoughts of another terrorist attack following the recent bomb blast at Gran Canaria. A plane parked on the apron reported visible fire through the fog, but its exact location and source remained uncertain. It was only when attempts to contact the 2 747s went unanswered that the controllers grasped the magnitude of the tragedy. As airport firefighters swiftly moved toward the dim glow of flames, they encountered the fully engulfed fuselage of KLM Flight 4805 on the runway. Despite immediate firefighting efforts, hopes for survivors seemed bleak. Several minutes later, as the fog lifted, another fire approximately 450 meters up the runway became visible. Initially presumed to be another part of the KLM wreckage, the responders were horrified to discover it was the remnants of Pan Am Flight 1736. Amidst the shattered debris, survivors cried for help against a backdrop of immense devastation. The rescue operation was rapid but chaotic. The available ambulances quickly filled, and private cars transported numerous individuals to the hospital. A call for more vehicles went out on the radio, but by the time additional help arrived at the airport, all survivors had been evacuated. Unfortunately, the number of survivors was far fewer than anticipated. Of the 248 occupants on KLM Flight 4805, none survived. Investigators later determined that the impact itself was not especially violent. But the rapid spread of the fire allowed little time for occupants to leave their seats, let alone open exit doors. On Pan Am Flight 1736, where fire was the primary cause of death, the toll was even higher. Initially reported as 327 out of 396 on board, the number later increased to 335 as severely burned victims succumbed to their injuries. Ultimately, only 61 survived, including all the Pan Am pilots. The official death toll settled at 583, but in the chaotic aftermath, reported numbers varied from 530 to over 600 as authorities struggled to reconcile the numerous missing individuals with the remains laid out in the hangar at Los Rodeos. Regardless of the precise toll, it was evident from the outset that the Tenerife disaster marked the deadliest crash in aviation history, surpassing the 1974 Turkish Airlines Flight 981 tragedy, which claimed 346 lives. In contrast to many large-scale accidents with victims from various parts of the world, the majority of those lost in the Tenerife disaster hailed from just two locations, California and the Netherlands. Both communities shared a collective sense of shock and grief. The residents of the Canary Islands, despite losing few of their own, grappled with disbelief that such a tragedy could unfold in their close-knit community. Statements from the Fuerzas Armadas Guanches, whose crude bomb initiated the tragic sequence of events, expressed genuine horror at the accident's scale. They denied any intention to cause such destruction, although later revelations from the group's leader, reporting from exile in Algeria, suggested that tourists should have refrained from visiting the islands during a period of armed struggle. As investigators from Spain, the Netherlands, and the United States descended upon Tenerife, they confronted the aviation industry's worst nightmare, a fatal collision involving two heavily loaded jumbo jets. The crash site resembled an apocalyptic scene, with wreckage scattered along the runway for several hundred meters. The Pan Am jet, with its left wing protruding from a pile of charred metal, and the KLM plane, split into several pieces, presented a haunting tableau of destruction. The chain of events leading to the crash unfolded through a bizarrely long sequence. Neither plane was initially destined for Tenerife, diverting there after the closure of Gran Canaria. The KLM's parking position obstructed the Pan Am jet's taxiing path, despite their readiness to depart earlier. Delays ensued as efforts were made to locate all KLM passengers and refuel, coinciding with the island's notorious fog, restricting visibility and necessitating radio communication for coordination. A series of misunderstandings ensued, with the Pan Am crew missing their expected exit, and the KLM captain, apparently misinterpreting a clearance, initiated takeoff without permission. Simultaneous warnings that could have revealed his mistake cancelled each other out, leading to him hearing neither. This was the sequence of events, but unraveling the underlying reasons would prove a challenging and controversial task. Central to the investigation was the question of why KLM Captain Jacob van Zanten initiated takeoff without proper clearance. He held a revered position at KLM, serving as the head of the airline's Boeing 747 training program, so esteemed that the airline initially sought him for the crash investigation, unaware of his demise. How could someone of Van Zanten's caliber commit such a fundamental error? The challenge with Van Zanten lay in his recent professional focus. Over the past decade, he had primarily engaged in training flights, conducting only the essential minimum of actual flights required to keep his type rating current. Before the accident, he hadn't flown a regular line flight for 12 weeks. Notably, during training flights in a simulator, the instructor takes on both pilot and air traffic controller roles, providing clearances as needed. In such scenarios, the trainee typically receives a clearance at the runway threshold, and takeoff follows promptly. While Van Zanten was well aware of the necessity of a controller's clearance in real-world scenarios, his extensive time as an instructor conditioned him to the point where his instinct, if he were to revert to it for some reason, was to take off without clearance. Investigators believed that he came close to doing so before First Officer Mers intervened with a crucial, "Wait a minute." Another contributing factor involved the ambiguity in certain communications. When Mers contacted the controller, his transmission seemed to request both takeoff clearance, "Now ready for takeoff," and ATC clearance, "And we are waiting for our ATC clearance." Both pilots, assuming the Pan Am plane had likely cleared the runway, expected to receive both clearances promptly. However, the controller only granted the ATC clearance. Crucially, he used the term "takeoff" in the transmission, "right turn after takeoff." Precisely the cue that Captain Van Zanten was conditioned to anticipate. While First Officer Mers might have sensed something amiss with Van Zanten's decision to initiate takeoff, any doubt he harbored seemingly dissipated when the controller responded with a casual "okay" to his hurried report of being now at takeoff/taking off. The controller, viewing the situation differently, did not have a clear reason to suspect that the KLM would initiate takeoff without clearance. He understood Mers's transmission as an indication that they had assumed the takeoff position. Despite the ambiguity causing some unease, his response of "okay" aimed more at filling the air as he gathered his thoughts, contemplating an instruction that made sense irrespective of whether the plane was stationary or in motion. The Pan Am pilots, also unsettled by the situation, decided to clarify their position during the pause after "okay." Unbeknownst to both the Pan Am crew and the controller, they were broadcasting, causing interference that neither party detected. The KLM crew, hearing distorted voices beneath a shrill squeal, likely perceived it as irrelevant and made no attempt to clarify its content. Shortly afterward, another exchange between the Pan Am crew and the controller presented a second opportunity to avert the accident. When First Officer Bragg mentioned, "We'll report when we're clear," he essentially communicated that they were still on the runway. However, several factors contributed to the KLM crew's failure to assimilate this crucial information. In situations with multiple voices, the human brain tends to focus on key words signaling relevance to the listener, such as a person's name or an aircraft call sign. Having spent a considerable time coordinating with the Pan Am plane that afternoon, the KLM crew would have been primed to pay attention upon hearing the call sign, "Clipper." However, for the first time that day, the controller used the NATO alphabet call sign, Papa Alpha, instead, failing to capture the KLM pilot's attention. Only flight engineer Schroeder listened closely enough to discern the message. However, Bragg's commitment to "report when clear" wasn't as explicit as "we are still on the runway," leaving Schroeder possibly wondering, clear of what? Captain Van Zanten's emphatic assurance that the Pan Am had cleared the runway seemed to convince him that everything was in order. A potential factor influencing the junior crewmember's judgment about the Pan Am's location could be an unwillingness to believe that Van Zanten would make such a significant mistake of taking off while another plane was still on the runway. This steep authority gradient might have been reinforced by Van Zanten recently granting Mers his Boeing 747 type rating, and Schroeder's perspective favoring a limited role for flight engineers in operational decision-making. This resulted in a crew inclined to accept that, in moments of uncertainty, Van Zanten was likely correct, and they were likely wrong. However, even seasoned pilots can err under pressure. On that day, the pressure on Van Zanten was exceptionally intense. It was far from a routine flight, laden with abnormal considerations and impromptu decisions for both crews. The KLM crew grappled with concerns about complying with stringent duty time regulations, worsening weather, and escalating delays. Additionally, Van Zanten expressed worry about his wife's concern if she learned about the bomb explosion from the evening news. To compound matters, they had been on duty all day, undoubtedly battling fatigue. In summary, Van Zanten faced numerous stressors converging from various directions. Under stressful conditions, an individual's perception tends to narrow, affecting their ability to manage multiple tasks simultaneously. Analysis of the cockpit voice recording from the KLM flight indicated that Captain Van Zanten was not actively tracking the conversations between First Officer Mers and air traffic control during taxi and takeoff. He had to request clarification multiple times. This suggested a heightened focus on the taxiing process, intensified by the challenging conditions of fog, absence of taxiway markings, and a tight turn at the runway's end, demanding heightened concentration. Consequently, he would rely more on specific keywords to capture the essence of ATC communications, potentially leading to an interpretation aligned with his anticipated scenario. Another manifestation of stress is a regression to deeply ingrained habits at the expense of conscious decision-making. Given Van Zanten's extensive experience in a training environment, where immediate takeoff clearance was customary once the trainee was positioned on the runway, his automatic expectation would be swift clearance. Under stressful conditions, an individual's perception tends to narrow, affecting their ability to manage multiple tasks simultaneously. Analysis of the cockpit voice recording from the KLM flight indicated that Captain Van Zanten was not actively tracking the conversations between First Officer Mers and air traffic control during taxi and takeoff. He had to request clarification multiple times. This suggested a heightened focus on the taxiing process, intensified by the challenging conditions of fog, absence of taxiway markings, and a tight turn at the runway's end, demanding heightened concentration. Consequently, he would rely more on specific keywords to capture the essence of ATC communications, potentially leading to an interpretation aligned with his anticipated scenario. Another manifestation of stress is a regression to deeply ingrained habits at the expense of conscious decision-making. Given Van Zanten's extensive experience in a training environment, where immediate takeoff clearance was customary once the trainee was positioned on the runway, his automatic expectation would be swift clearance. These stress-related behaviors synergized, convincing Captain Van Zanten that he had received clearance to commence rolling upon hearing the controller use the term takeoff. The Spanish investigators, in their final report, largely assigned blame to Van Zanten for taking off without clearance. Simplifying the complexities. The Dutch response to the report took an equally questionable position, portraying Van Zanten as entirely blameless. The Dutch comments included several contentious assertions, such as dismissing any evidence of stress, claiming no issues with the authority gradient, and attributing no errors to the KLM crew, instead attributing the incident to a series of unfortunate misunderstandings. Their report even suggested that the controllers were listening to a football match, insinuating a cover-up by Spain, although the Dutch investigators acknowledged this likely had no impact on the sequence of events. Notably, they refrained from assigning blame to the controller or the Pan Am crew. According to them, the system itself was at fault for the crash. While their portrayal of the KLM pilots prompted skepticism, the Dutch investigators were essentially correct in asserting that the crash's causes extended beyond Captain Van Zanten's mistaken decision to take off without clearance. The Tenerife disaster unfolded against the backdrop of four systemic issues. Firstly, the criminalization of procedural lapses introduced undue stress and apprehension within the KLM crew, prompting suboptimal decision-making. The Dutch flight duty time regulations, emblematic of a broader trend driven by public pressure lacking aviation safety comprehension, sought to criminalize errors and violations that could be more appropriately addressed internally by airlines. Secondly, an imbalanced cockpit hierarchy fostered an environment of deference to the captain, where junior crew members hesitated to challenge the captain's decisions. In the Tenerife disaster, this resulted in self-doubt, hindering the first officer and flight engineer from expressing their concerns fully, under the misconception that the captain possessed superior situational understanding. Thirdly, imprecise terminology introduced confusion, leading to conflicting mental models among air crews and controllers. Instances like the ambiguous use of takeoff in an ATC clearance, the unexpected shift from Clipper to Papa Alpha in call signs, and phrases such as, "We are now at takeoff," "We'll report when we're clear," and "Okay," contributed to recurrent misunderstandings that directly contributed to the crash. The controller's accent and limited knowledge of the 747's maneuvering capabilities further compounded the challenges, prolonging the Pan Am plane's presence on the runway. Lastly, the fundamental cause lay in the inadequate infrastructure at Los Rodeos Airport. The absence of ground radar, particularly in fog-prone conditions, hindered precise airplane positioning on the airport surface. Inadequate controller numbers and insufficient experience to manage Boeing 747s exacerbated the situation. The airport's limited capacity for diverted airplanes necessitated unconventional taxi procedures, including the risky backtaxiing maneuver. Despite frequent low visibility, the airport lacked essential features like taxiway markings and reliable means for measuring runway visibility range. Collectively, these deficiencies underscored the critical reliance on unambiguous radio communications for safety in such a challenging operational environment. Several elements in the chain of events leading to the Tenerife disaster were subject to chance, beyond human control. The pervasive fog, a critical factor, played a role beyond anyone's influence, making the accident inevitable in its absence. A mere 4-meter increase in the gap beside the KLM 747 or a slight alteration in the timing of microphone usage by the controller and the Pan Am crew could have averted the collision. The added weight from newly introduced fuel also played a role, potentially altering the outcome if not for this factor. This susceptibility to coincidences underscores the inherent risks in an unstable, complex system. The interconnected decisions at Los Rodeos formed a system where control was fragmented, unintentional consequences rippled through each decision, and increasing complexity escalated stress, narrowing perception and contributing to a catastrophic collapse, precisely what transpired in Tenerife. The aftermath of the Tenerife disaster prompted significant changes in the aviation industry. Directly impacting radio communications, global standardization of terminology increased, with controllers refraining from using the term takeoff except when granting clearance. The transformation of ATC clearance to route clearance aimed at preventing confusion, often provided before departure from the gate. The incident also accelerated the adoption of taxiway markings, now a standard feature at every airport. The disaster is often attributed to the genesis of Crew Resource Management, CRM, a universally implemented set of strategies promoting open communication and optimal task distribution in airline cockpits. While Tenerife is recognized as a contributing factor, the development of CRM was a complex process. It emerged from pre-existing and post-accident research, with Tenerife serving as one of many incidents prompting a closer examination of cultural issues in the cockpit. The disaster intensified efforts to address these concerns, though the underlying problem and potential solutions were acknowledged before the ill-fated takeoff of KLM Flight 4805. The tragedy added its toll of 583 lives to the mounting evidence advocating for systemic change. Spain emerged as the least proactive country in preventing a recurrence of the Tenerife tragedy. Despite the role of inadequate infrastructure in facilitating the accident, Spanish authorities seemed content to place exclusive blame on Captain Van Zanten, avoiding substantial action on their part. The construction of a new airport on the dry side of Tenerife, a pre-existing plan, was the only noteworthy change. Los Rodeos Airport, notorious after the disaster, remained largely unaltered. In 1980, another crash occurred there, resulting in 146 fatalities. Radar, recommended after Tenerife, had not been installed, and insufficient taxiway markings contributed to a Madrid runway collision 6 years later, claiming 93 lives. Spain took 2 decades to implement necessary improvements and mitigate further tragedies. In some accidents, changes following the incident can be seen as preventing future loss, but the considerable number of deaths and a relatively subdued response make it challenging to make the same claim for Tenerife. How can one rationalize the loss of 583 lives in mere moments? How can the devastation stemming from a 4-meter difference, a noise, or a word be reconciled with peace in the world? Over time, the aviation industry and the public have coped with these unsettling questions by mythologizing the disaster, imbuing it with an air of fate or even predestination. This narrative masks the senselessness and preventability of the errors leading to the tragedy. Captain Jacob van Zanten has been constructed as a folk villain, portraying him as an angry, self-aggrandizing recklessness. In reality, there is no evidence to support such a depiction. Van Zanten may have overestimated his ability, but he was not malevolent. Present-day summaries often falsely suggest that Van Zanten knowingly took off without clearance, distorting the truth. Villainizing a captain who made a mistake is not an indictment of our collective humanity, but as a coping mechanism, it falls short. Most plane crashes result from normal individuals making decisions based on incorrect information, and Tenerife is no exception. It is peculiar how the spectacle of mass death can divert attention from this fundamental truth. As we conclude this somber exploration of the Tenerife disaster, a poignant reminder emerges: the consequences of that fateful day extend far beyond the immediate loss of 583 lives. The incident serves as a profound testament to the interconnected nature of decisions, systemic flaws, and the pivotal role infrastructure plays in aviation safety. While the tragedy has triggered industry-wide reforms, its true impact transcends the realm of air travel, inviting contemplation on the fragility of human lives amidst a complex web of circumstances. We encourage you to reflect on the lessons learned from the Tenerife disaster, acknowledging the imperative for continual improvements in aviation protocols, communication standards, and airport infrastructure. If you found this exploration insightful, do consider expressing your appreciation by liking this content and subscribing to our channel. Your support enables us to delve deeper into critical historical events, fostering a greater understanding of the complexities that shape our world. Thank you for joining us on this journey, and we look forward to sharing more compelling narratives with you in the future.